I've just finished binge watching it with my wife, and that is, of course, the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary. Um, Now, the fact that my wife watched it says a lot because she does not watch anything to do with wrestling. Um, but we both came out of that 6 parts of that series, her with very little wrestling knowledge, me with a lot, both feeling pretty underwhelmed and unsatisfied by the whole piece, really. My feeling was that it kind of barely scraped the surface of anything that I wanted to know about. But you featured in a lot of the episodes and you came across very positively. I wondered how you landed on it, kind of having watched the final edit back and how it compared to what you were expecting when you were doing all those interviews with Netflix.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated the documentary for what a documentary is and how they're produced and the story that they try to tell. I think it was very well edited. I think the producers did absolutely the best job possible.
Mm,
Given that, and people have to keep in mind, so much of what we heard from Vince McMahon was prior to the most recent controversy and allegations.
yeah.
And it was evident to me, it may have been lost on others who don't haven't worked with Vince and been around him for any length of time. It was evident in the documentary to me, and I think to others who have worked with Vince, but so much of all of those interviews that we heard from Vince, in my opinion at least, weren't designed from Vince's perspective to give us any real insight as to how he thinks or how he works. It was more a branding initiative. It was the perception, and Vince talked a lot about reality and perception. It was the perception, therefore the reality that Vince was attempting to create for his brand, meaning he wanted us to hear the stories about him and his father. He wanted us to hear about some of the infidelity. He wanted us to hear how he reacts to certain things that is so much different than the average person might. Those are all things I think Vince, if it makes sense to other people or not, Vince wanted to project the image that he projected in that documentary because he didn't know what was coming.
Yeah.
So I think we got glimpses, brief glimpses, almost like photographs in terms of who Vince McMahon really is and how he really thinks. But it was overshadowed by a lot of the perception that Vince McMahon was trying to create. So I don't think we got to know Vince McMahon real well. We got little glimpses of him. And I think people that have worked with Vince in the past probably recognize those glimpses much more than people who have never been around Vince.
Mm.
But there was and even the producers, Bill Simmons and the other gentleman came out right away and said, look, we didn't produce this for knowledgeable wrestling fans. We produced this for a worldwide audience on Netflix. And as of right now, more than 5 million people around the world have watched that documentary. And a good portion of them are not wrestling fans and maybe had never really thought too much about it. And that's what they were producing for. So I understand why people who are like you, who have been following the business and following Vince's career over the years and all of the things that are going on, didn't learn anything new. This is the WCW Nitro story, the Monday Night War story, a lot of the stories we've heard before. But you got to keep in mind that 90% of the rest of the audience haven't. So for them, it may be a little bit more fulfilling. Now, your wife is an example of someone who's not a wrestling fan, who didn't know what you know, who was also underwhelmed. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that given the recent allegations and controversies, we wanted more of that. That's what we were really hoping to see. And that situation is ongoing. There's no resolution. There's no ending to that story as of yet. So it's kind of hard, especially with all of the litigation and everything that's going on. It's kind of hard to dig into that story with too much detail because number one, it hasn't been resolved yet. And there's a lot of question marks. And number two, Vince wasn't going to talk. Vince couldn't have talked about it in this documentary because it didn't exist when this thing was produced and when those interviews were produced. So I think to that extent, I think the average person, consciously or subconsciously, was really expecting something powerful with regard to the recent allegations, and it's just not possible yet.